Welcome to Band Tier. This is the channel where I discuss some of my favorite bands and rank their discographies so you guys know where to begin. And this is the final part of a three-part series discussing Swedish progressive metal legends, Opeth. We have made it to the home stretch. In this video, I'm going to discuss the 4 Opeth albums released in the 2010s, which are Heritage, Hail Communion, Sorceress, and cauda venenum. I've already covered the Opeth albums released in the 90s and 2000s in parts 1 and 2, so feel free to go watch those to get up to speed. The 2010s will be a massive sonic shift for Opeth, as they would completely abandon their death metal growls. This move was heavily criticized by fans, especially at first. I personally think that while the death metal vocals were part of what made Opeth so great, they were only a small part, and they still made some really great music in the 2010s. These albums are a pretty good place to begin if you aren't into death metal, as they lack death metal, and they have a more accessible sound that definitely has its time and place. As always, I'm going to put these albums into a tier list as we go so you can see how I think they stack up to each other. So let's get into it with the first album of this new era of Opeth, Heritage. Heritage is the 10th Opeth album to be released. There's another lineup change here, with Joachim Svalberg taking over the keyboards. Heritage was the first album from the new prog rock era of Opeth, and this one did not garner great initial reactions at all, as albums that meddle with the template tend to do. What Opeth did here, however, that frustrated many was they did a tour where they only played songs with clean singing, and they didn't mention this beforehand on the tour, and people weren't happy with that. The reaction to this album was so extreme that many fans started abandoning ship on the band with this release. So what do I think of Heritage? I don't think Heritage is a bad album by any means. There's lots of good stuff here, but I would be lying if I said that I like this album a lot. I'd say overall it's a net good album, but when I think of what the weakest Opeth album is, yeah, it's this one. My main problem with Heritage is not the lack of death metal growls. I made it very clear that while I love the death metal growls, they are only a part of why I love Opeth so much. My thing with Heritage is that Opeth are a band that make big, cohesive albums meant to be listened to front to back, and Heritage is just not that. It really meanders off at times, and there is a lot of, I hate using this word to describe Opeth, but filler on here. Now, this album still has some great tracks. That opening song, The Devil's Orchard, is very strong, with a great opening riff and some awesome drumming. And that's something I'll give this album credit for. Many of the songs on here do feature some great and complex drumming. Axe is a fantastic drummer. Nepenthe is another one that I really like, and while it is very strange, it does use the keyboards very well, and it's overall a good song. I Feel the Dark is another good one. But honestly, Heritage is not something I find myself ever listening to in full. It's just those select songs. The other Opeth prog albums, while different from the classic Opeth albums, still are unmistakably Opeth. You can tell what band they are immediately. But Heritage honestly just, it doesn't sound the same. This album is overall pretty forgettable in the shadow of something like Still Life or Blackwater Park, and if we want to compare it to other clean albums, it's just not nearly as good as Damnation, or even some of the albums that would follow it. I don't want you guys to get the impression that I'm ragging on this album, or that I think it's bad, because I don't think Heritage is a bad album at all. It's got good songs. Here's the thing. Opeth aren't a band that make albums that have a few good songs and a bunch of filler. So when you're comparing your album to, like, I have 5 albums in S tier with Opeth, and then the A tier albums, Morning Rise, Deliverance, also really solid, and those don't even crack close to the top of Opeth stuff. So in comparison to the other Opeth albums, yeah, Heritage sticks out like a sore thumb. But overall, is this album solid? Yeah, it's fine. But it's Opeth. When you listen to Opeth, you don't listen to them because you want something fine. You listen to them because you want something that will absolutely blow your mind, and an album that's incredible front to back. Heritage does not offer that. I'm going to put Heritage in C tier. Now, keep in mind, with my tier list system, this is the albums being compared to each other. So, S tier is absolutely incredible, listen to it immediately. A tier is great. B tier is really good. And then C tier is kind of just alright. So, it's not a bad album. Don't get that impression. But compared to other Opeth albums, yeah, this one it doesn't hit the same. And I can definitely see why that is. I mean, Opeth went for this whole completely different sound, and they were refining that sound they wanted to continue in again. If you notice, I would say the second to bottom Opeth album is Orchid, their debut album. And that album, it's the same thing. It feels messy because they're experimenting with... It wasn't a new sound at the time because it was they were a new band. And that's why that album feels messy, is because they were trying to hone that in. And then they really did with their second album, Morning Rise. And with the prog rock stuff, same thing. Heritage is really messy, but then later on they really honed it in. And I think that is expressed perfectly with the next album I'm going to talk about, Pale Communion. 2014's Pale Communion was the follow-up to Heritage. This was another prog album, lacking the death metal, which confirmed that this was the path Opeth would continue to take. However, while touring in support for this album, they returned to playing older songs that contained the death metal growls. I think this is a good thing, as even if people don't like the newer Opeth albums and the new style, they can still hear those old albums and songs live. Pale Communion overall as an album gets a lot of flack, and I know quite a few people would actually rank this at the very bottom of the list of Opeth albums. This is actually an album where I'm going to disagree with the general consensus. I think Pale Communion is great. It takes what Heritage tried to do, and it steps everything up in quality tenfold, and I love it. It's got a lot of great stuff. All of Pale Communion is good, but it's the first 3 tracks that really sell it for me. Eternal Rains Will Come was actually the first Opeth song I heard after I got into heavy music. I loved it back then, and I think years later, I actually love it even more. It's one of my personal favorite Opeth songs. The intro is a great bass line, great keyboard work, and awesome drumming. That was the first thing I noticed about Opeth when I heard this song, was my first thoughts were, wow, that drummer is incredible. The middle slows right down into this beautiful, relaxing, peaceful section, and the vocals really begin in the last part of the song. As the name suggests, the song talks about the biblical floods, and someone who is about to be hit by them. The desperation is really well shown in Mikhail's voice, as well as great use of vocal harmonies. Eternal Rains Will Come is amazing, and in my opinion is the best Opeth song released post-Watershed. Cusp of Eternity is another really good song. What I think it shows off best is Mikhail's ability as a vocalist, hitting higher register notes with precision and ease. His clean vocal ability really improved in this decade, and Pale Communion is where that really began to show. Plus, the chorus for the song is so catchy. It's hard to not get this one stuck in your head. Moon Above, Sun Below brings back one part of that classic Opeth formula. Long songs. This one clocks in at over 10 minutes. It's got some great keyboard work and a really groovy rhythm. And while it's not as drastic as on an earlier album like Ghost Reveries, it's got those loud, soft shifts everyone loves Opeth for. The guitar solo here is also really great, and it's immediately followed by an a cappella section that always gives me chills. Moon Above, Sun Below is a song that, while different in sound from the classic Opeth records, is still unmistakably Opeth. I think what makes Pale Communion so much better than Heritage in my books is what I mentioned in Moon Above, Sun Below. And that is that while this album sounds different from the formula we're used to with Opeth, it still unmistakably sounds like Opeth. And that's something that can be said about Heritage. And there's some songs I didn't mention on here, but something like River is another great one. And yeah, there's not any songs on this album that I think are bad. There's some that are kind of just fine. But overall, this album is front to back very solid, and those first three are all great. So, this is a bit of an unpopular opinion, because I know a lot of people out there really don't like Pale Communion, but as far as I'm concerned, yeah, this is a really good album, and honestly, it's better than some of the albums they did that had death metal growling on them. I genuinely like this thing. Overall, I'm going to stick Pale Communion at the high end of B tier. I would take it over the other albums I have in B tier right now, which I know is blasphemy to some of you guys, but yeah, I like Pale Communion better than I like Watershed. It's got, like... Now, I am a little biased because Eternal Rains Will Come does heavily weight that. I absolutely love that song. But still, the rest of this album is very good, especially something like Moon Above, Sun Below. And I think this album shows huge improvement from Heritage. And the musicianship is great here. Axe is doing a fantastic job, as always, with the drumming. But Mikhail's clean singing, not that it was ever, not great, but it really gets better on Pale Communion, and it will continue to get better through the rest of this decade. So I don't really get the hate for this album. This is always kind of going to be an album I have a soft spot for. And if you're not really big into the death metal growls, I think Pale Communion is an excellent place to start if you want to get into Opeth. Sorceress came out in 2016, the year in which I really got into Opeth, so this was the first album from them that I really followed from the release of the first single up until the actual album release. Sorceress continues the prog rock sound Opeth had been going for in the 2010s. This was the first album since Still Life in 1999 to not be produced by Steven Wilson. Instead, they grabbed producer Tom Delgatti for this album. Overall, I think Sorceress is an album that has some very strong songs on it, but this is not one of my favorite Opeth albums by a long shot, and I would say it's a step down from Pale Communion. That's not to say I don't love some of the songs on here. The opening title track starts with an interesting keyboard intro before going into one of the heaviest Opeth riffs since they adopted their new sound. The vocals here are very strong and the verses are catchy. Sorceress the song really is fantastic. This album came out the year that I really got into Opeth, 2016, so I followed it right from the single up until the album release and whatever. And the first time I heard that first single, Sorceress, I think it came out at the beginning of August, it really blew me away. I was really hyped for the new Opeth album. And did the rest of the album live up to this single? No. Besides one song we'll get to later. But I remember there was a period of time where I had this track on repeat. I was just listening to it over and over and over again. And yeah, it is rather unfortunate that the rest of this album isn't quite as strong. Another strong song on Sorceress is The Wildflowers. Sorceress is overall the heaviest of the prog albums that Opeth have put out, and this track is a good example of that. The way the vocals and the first riff line up is really cool, and I do like it. Plus, it's got a guitar solo that just rocks. Will-O-the-Wisp is a beautiful, almost folky ballad that I really like as well. Era is the other song on here, along with the title track, that I love. I love that piano intro before the song kicks into high gear with an awesome riff and some amazing drumming from Axe. But honestly, besides those 4 tracks, I don't really dig anything else on Sorceress, and some songs like The Seventh Sojourn I just flat out dislike. Sorceress seems to generally be received more positively than albums like Heritage and Pale Communion, so it might be a bit of an unpopular opinion. Well, I'd still take it over Heritage, but it might be a bit of an unpopular opinion that I think this is a big step down from Pale Communion. Now, part of that might be that when Sorceress the song came out, and it was in the year where I was already super excited about Opeth, and I went into this album with really high expectations because I liked everything I heard. And I was pretty disappointed when the album didn't live up to the expectations I had for it. So maybe that's part of it, but it's been 4 years, and honestly, in those 4 years, I've maybe only listened to Sorceress 5 or 6 times, and one of those was leading up to this video to make it, compared to some of the other Opeth albums. I've maybe listened to Pale Communion 10 or 15 times. And, my favorite Opeth albums like Blackwater Park and Still Life, I listen to them pretty much on a weekly basis. So this one just doesn't sit with me as high as some of the other Opeth albums. But that's okay, because there are songs on here I'll always go back on. Overall, I'm going to place Sorceress in B tier. I like some of the stuff on here. I don't like some of the stuff on here as well. So I think it's kind of fitting. If most bands were to put this album out, it would be one of the stronger albums of their career. It's just Opeth have so much great material, and my expectations were so high for this album that it didn't really meet them, and still 4 years later, I'm not the biggest fan of Sorceress. I would probably rank this in the bottom 3 Opeth albums. I'd take it over Heritage, definitely. I think I'd take it over Orchid, but I wouldn't take it over something like Watershed, or I definitely wouldn't take it over Pale Communion. Still, though, there's some great stuff on here. I think everyone trying to get into Opeth should listen to that title track, especially if you really like the older death metal stuff, but not the newer stuff as much. That title track is probably the heaviest song Opeth made in this decade. So Sorceress is a good album, it's just not something amazing. At last, we have reached the final album. The most recent Opeth album to date is 2019's cauda, venenum. This is a unique album in that it has 2 versions, one in English and one in Swedish. I listen to the English version more as I'm an English speaker myself, but the Swedish side is a really cool listen, and whenever they play songs live off of this album, they do play them in Swedish. I was curious to see how Opeth would follow up Sorceress. I knew it would be another prog album, but I didn't know what to expect other than a prog album before I heard the first single, Heart in Hand. Safe to say, especially after Sorceress, which is kind of a disappointing album, I was floored the first time I heard Heart in Hand. I absolutely loved it, and it made me super excited to see how this album would be. And you know what? This is the best Opeth album in years. Cauda venenum blew me away the first time I heard it, and now over a year later, this album still blows me away. I finally think Opeth have figured out the formula to making a stellar prog rock album. This album is a fantastic experience. The opening track, Dignity, starts off right out of the gate with some great high harmonized notes and a wicked guitar solo from Aucassin. It gets quiet on the first verse before ascending into the massive chorus that just absolutely rocks. Dignity proves that Opeth can make a fantastic song with some great hooks in this new formula. The next track was the first song released as a single, Heart in Hand. I mentioned this earlier, but this song blew me away on my first listen. Axe leads the charge on the intro, laying down a really awesome drum beat before the riffs come in. Mikhail's vocals here are phenomenal, and just like Dignity, this one has some great hooks. At 8 minutes, it shows Opeth getting back into those long songs that everyone knows and loves them for. Lovelorn Crime is a fantastic song with a great piano and softly sung intro. The emotion is presented great in the vocals here. I absolutely love the melancholy feeling this song has. My favorite song on the album is All Things Will Pass, however. It starts with a guitar that gives me an eerie vibe before heading into a much heavier, doom-sounding riff. It's the outro for this song that seals the nails in the coffin for me. This is one of Mikhail's best vocal performances at the end, and you can really hear the desperation and emotion in his voice at the ending of this song. This is a haunting yet beautiful masterpiece, and I think it's the perfect way to close out a pretty much perfect album. Of the four 2010s Opeth albums, there is no question in my mind that In Cauda Venenum is the best one. This is the album where I feel like they really perfected that prog rock sound with the clean vocals. It's still got some amazing riffs. Like, some of these songs, like Heart in Hand, are just great riff after great riff after great riff. And it's got the highs while still keeping the full album format, which is Opeth are an albums band. So it's good to have them getting back into that. I didn't cover every song on this album. I just covered like the real standouts, but there isn't a song on this album that's bad by any means. And I think give it some more time and people are going to be ranking this as one of the Opeth classics. I wouldn't put it top 5 Opeth albums, but it's up there. I'd say easily on a tier with Deliverance or Morning Rise. Overall, In Cauda Venenum is 100% an A-tier album. This album I don't feel like is amazing on the level of Still Life or Blackwater Park, but this album is still amazing. I can't think of any flaws with this thing. And the high points are really high, like All Things Will Pass, Heart in Hand, Dignity, Lovelorn Crime. These are all songs that are going to be just classics of Opeth for many years to come. And I'm sure once bands start touring again, that you will see many of these songs in the live sets for quite a long time. This album really gives me hope for the future of Opeth, because they kind of had that rough patch. I mean, Pale Communion was great, but I'm in the minority for thinking that. And this album, in my opinion, is easily the best thing they've ever made since Ghost Reveries. And this album really gives me a lot of hope for what the next Opeth stuff will be. I mean, it's a high bar to set, but if anyone can surpass it, it'll be Opeth. And In Cauda Venenum, must listen. If you're into prog music, if you're into rock music, if you're into metal, or if you want to get into Opeth, yeah, this album I'd say is mandatory listening. Alright, so now up on screen I have the final tier list. I've got albums in each column from left to right is my favorite album in each tier on the left, my least favorite album in each tier on the right. Overall, Opeth, I'm a bit biased because they're one of my favorite bands of all time, maybe my favorite band of all time. So they mean more to me than they do to most people. I at least enjoy every Opeth album. I think with these tier lists, the only albums I think are bad, I'm going to put in D tier. C tier above is varying ranges of good, with like C tier being pretty good, S tier being amazing. If you want to get into Opeth, it honestly just depends on what you're looking for going in. If you really like death metal, I think Blackwater Park is the album to start with. That is the album most people seem to really like from Opeth, and for good reason. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. Front to back, it's phenomenal. Tracks like Bleak, The Drapery Falls, that absolute monster of a title track. Blackwater Park was the album that got me into Opeth, and it really means a lot to me. But some people don't like the death metal growls that much, and that's okay. The death metal growls are only a small part of what makes Opeth so great. And for those people, Damnation is your album. It's soft, it's got some beautiful melodies, and it's really melancholy. There's Damnation's another album that front to back I think is incredible. Some of the death metal purists may not like it, but for me, I think it's right up there as one of the best Opeth albums. My favorite album from them, though, Still Life. No question. The storyline of that thing is just so good. No, I can't think of another album that tells a story like Still Life does. And it's got just some of Opeth's best guitar work in it, especially the acoustic sections on something like Godhead's Lament, Benighted, Face of Melinda. And the really heavy songs, Serenity, Painted Death, The Moor, Moonlapse Vertigo, White Cluster. It's an album I think every fan of heavy metal should listen to from front to back. That being said, because it's so story-based, I think Still Life can be a bit of a tedious listen. So I would say if you're not familiar with Opeth, start with Blackwater Park. And the other albums are very solid. The other albums I got there in S tier, My Arms, Your Hearse. I mean, that one's got Demon of the Fall on it. It's got When on it. Those are some of the classic, amazing Opeth songs. Ghost Reveries is another one. That album's dark, and I love it. Ghost Reveries is another 10 out of 10 album in my books. So with Opeth, there's so much great material to start with. They're a band that I think everyone should really at least give a chance, give a listen to. I really enjoyed making this video series. I know it was a bit long. I covered Opeth. There's so much to cover, and I went pretty in depth with each of their albums. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, so I'll just leave this up. This is my final ranking of all of Opeth's album. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, comment on what you thought, subscribe. And if you want more, I have part 1 where I cover the 490s Opeth records. I have part 2 where I cover the 5 2000s Opeth records. And yeah, that's the end of the series now. The next one I'm going to do is I'm going to do a series on Metallica, discussing all of their albums. So a band that's a bit more familiar, and also where there's going to be a bit more variation in the quality of the albums. There's going to be some albums that are great and some albums that are really bad. So you guys have that to look forward to. Peace out. Hope you enjoy it. Have a good one.